I've met a lot of finance guys in startups who do not understand that simple idea that software requires high CapEx and low OpEx. And this idea of investing ahead of the business is essential. And so they're all tied up in like, well, Chris, that's a lot of money. And oh, Chris, I don't know if we can invest that right now. And oh, Chris, I'm not sure if we can raise money. And oh, Chris. And it's like, let me assure you, these are not my opinions. And let me assure you, you must raise money because your appetite and your commitments are way larger than your capital and your cash flow allow. And you cannot run this business on revenue. I find a lot of companies in this position with very conservative CFOs who just do not understand the basic economics and are fighting me tooth and nail on basic startup mechanics.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode. In-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hey, I'm Chris Saad.
And I'm Yaniv Bernstein. And welcome to today's listener Q&A episode. We've got a bunch of interesting questions about how can an engineer expand their mindset? How can finance folks get a better understanding of how product works in a product-led org? Building and maintaining a user base? And the most important question, when does a founder start to sound crazy? All that and more. Stay tuned to today's episode of the Startup Podcast. This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. You might know that sinking feeling. You're about to land a big contract when they ask about compliance. SOC 2, ISO, PCI, Essential 8. You've just snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Not anymore. Vanta massively accelerates your compliance efforts and allows you to get those life-changing deals back on track. Don't wait until it's panic stations, though. Get started with Vanta today. They're offering 20% off their prices just for TSP listeners. Do yourself a favor. Hit pause, go to vanta.com/TSP, that's VANTA.com, to get that 20% off. So, our first question comes from Akhil Ramani in Sydney, and he writes, having an engineering background, whenever I encounter any problems, I instantly start thinking from a technical perspective. How can I solve it like Mark Zuckerberg in the Social Network movie? I feel blank scaling ideas and when I don't know that technical solution. Can you advise on that? How to think from an entrepreneur's perspective on any situation or problem?
You know, there's obviously a lot of benefits to broadening your horizons, improving or covering off for your weaknesses, and just generally evolving and maturing as a person. But there's also a lot to be said about doubling down on what you're good at. There's a saying I've heard recently as a new parent, which is if your kid is really great at math and really bad with English, get him a math tutor, not an English tutor. The idea being that people have superpowers, and it's often better to double down on your superpowers than trying to be something you're not. So this is a balancing act here, right? So you certainly want to become more business savvy, more entrepreneurially effective, let's say. But I wouldn't be too hard on yourself either and try to become something you're not. If you're a wizard in engineering and your mind jumps to technical solutions and architectures and code and you are a rock star at that, then embrace and love what you're good at and find a co-founder who has the same level of intuition and feel and natural ability at the other things. But there are limits to this, right? Like you want to become better. Just don't spend all your time trying to become the best at this other different thing. Know what you're good at and cover off the weaknesses in other places with other people.
Yeah, look, I think that's good advice. I think there's a couple of points. First of all, you talk about Mark Zuckerberg in the Social Network movie, which is a fantastic movie. Aaron Sorkin is one of the best at creating these sorts of content, just as an aside. But if you actually think about Mark Zuckerberg, he has an engineering background, but what that movie teaches us is not that he was like, hey, how do I just build a big technical solution? He was very customer oriented, right? He knew his audience perfectly. It was other Harvard students who basically wanted to stalk each other online and then ultimately also wanted to see who was single so they could ask them out on dates a bit more safely. And that was his insight, right? It wasn't like, oh, I know how to build the best database. It was, I have a customer insight that I want to solve. So putting that to one side, I think even the kind of nerdiest, most technical founders who you can think of out there are actually always quite fixated on solving a customer problem. With technology, of course, but they start with the problem. But I think, Chris, your feedback was really spot on. And Akhil, obviously this is going to depend quite a lot on what your personal goals are. But if I look out in the world, there are far more non-technical founders who are obsessed with a problem than there are technical founders who can match up with them and help build the solution, right? So one suggestion I'd have, depending on your goals, is to go founder dating. Look for that non-technical co-founder who can really complement your skills, who is focused on the problem, who is focused on that more entrepreneur's perspective, as you say it. And first of all, you will be a great combination. Secondly, you will learn from them. How do you learn to think in this way? Is to learn from someone who's really good at it. And so if you're looking to be a founder and understand how valuable and rare your skills are, you're actually quite a catch, I think, who can think about these problems from a technical perspective. None of us are good at everything, as you say, Chris. Find someone who complements your skills rather than beating yourself up over those gaps.
I like that you're referring back to the movie. The movie and the reality also shows that Mark brought a lot of people along on the journey with him and for him, and a lot of people helped him. And it's really a team effort. No one ever achieves anything great on their own. And so if there's one thing you should get really, really good at, is enough salesmanship to bring people along on the journey and convince them to help you. And in this case, help you solve for your lack of customer centricity or focus. And that's really important.
Okay, so our next question comes from Mariana Gilcorona in Linköping, Sweden. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And Mariana asks, how can I build a customer user base and maintain it over time? So that's a very broad question, but Chris, I'm sure you've got some thoughts.
Oh dear. That's one of the three big questions that we talk about, right? It's like, how do you build something valuable? How do you put it in front of people, which is build a big customer base? And then how do you figure out how to do that at scale with monetization? So you're only asking for 1/3 of the startup recipe. If this was easy, everybody would do it. And so the first part of my answer will be, I can't answer this question in a 10-minute answer. But in my mind, the answer must begin in first imagining that group of people and getting very clear on who they are and what might concern them and what problems they have, and building something valuable for them. And so the search for these customers can't begin with the search itself. The search has to begin with an insight and then building something valuable for them. I guess the next part of the question must include figuring out how to communicate that value and how to meet them where they are. In marketing often would be referred to as channels, right? Are they on Facebook? Are they on LinkedIn? Are they on TikTok? Are they in meetings, webinars, conferences, and so on? And showing up and being part of that channel and saying those things that they would resonate with. But again, I'll go back to being there and having those conversations is more or less pointless or has diminishing returns, except for customer discovery and learning, if you don't have a valuable product or service to offer them positioned in the right way. And so for me as product guy, it always comes back to having something valuable, and people will fall into the gravity of that thing only once it is valuable. And so that's where I start.
Look, I agree with that. If you ask, how can I build a customer base, which is roughly what's called acquisition in the growth language, and maintain it over time, that's called retention. They're both to do with value in the end, but they have different relationships to that value. So once you have a user, maintaining it over time is really making sure that your product provides that sustained value so that they can continue to access it and they don't want to leave because you continue to be valuable. So retention, there are little hacks and tricks you can use to optimize your retention, but ultimately, retention is driven by having a product that is delivering sustained value. So there are no shortcuts to that. Now, acquisition is a little bit different, right? Because acquisition, it's a lot about marketing, right? Which is about discovering the value and then accessing the value. So if people don't know you exist, then they haven't discovered the value that you offer. They can't get the value if they don't know you exist. So that's the sort of the top of funnel marketing piece. And then, again, there's what's called in the growth parlance, conversion and activation, which is really about saying, okay, people know you exist. You know that there are folks who are using your product and getting the value. So how do you bridge people from knowing you exist to actually discovering that value? And that's a lot of what the discipline of growth is about, where it's saying, okay, people encounter my product. How quickly can I get them to experience that value so that they then stick around, right? Because the most valuable resource you have from people is their attention, and you get a limited amount of it, and you need to use that really well, right? So when you talk about how can I build a customer base, I think the distribution piece, it's not easy, right? But there are plenty of channels, such as a lot of folks start with Facebook marketing, Google marketing, that sort of stuff. But once you have their attention, how do you convert them? That's the real magic. So think about it again from that value lens. How can people experience my value? Sometimes also called the aha moment. I know you've used that phrase as well, Chris. It's like, how do they get from, I've clicked on an ad to, oh, I see where this thing fits into my life and makes my life better. And then you've got that user. So really, there's an element of taste and there's an element of talking to customers and kind of understanding the value equation or the value exchange that is happening there, right? If your product's not valuable for people, they will never stick around.
Yeah, as I said at the beginning, this question is so vast. There are entire podcasts about it and entire episodes on our show about it. And there is no single answer. Even if you're talking about ads and so on, that's a kind of consumery or self-adopt or product-led growth approach. If you're doing enterprise sales, a whole different approach. There's just no single answer. But one thing that I always think about, especially for companies that have some kind of product already, is I'm always encouraging the founders, the product managers, the team to think about one key question, which is, what is the number one reason more people are not more successful with my product more often? The number one reason. And there's often a kind of a cascading set of possible answers. So the first might be lack of awareness. They don't know about us. Lack of education. They know about us, but they don't understand. Lack of onboarding simplicity. So they understand, but they can't or don't onboard. Ease of payments or utility, right? They onboard, but they don't get it or they don't order or pay. And then there is a lack of retentiveness. So they pay, they try, but then they don't stick around. They don't experience the value long term. That's a very high level, very generic customer journey. And so if you have any semblance of a product and you're trying and struggling and failing to build that customer base, go through the customer journey and ask yourself, what is that number one reason? Number one, because it's probably all of the reasons have deficiencies. Like all of those things likely have deficiencies in your business. But what is the number one reason right now? And you solve that, and then you ask yourself that question again, and you solve that, and you just keep doing that, rinse and repeat. Colin Beatty from Melbourne, Australia asks, at what point does a founder start to sound crazy? In other words, how honest should we be in our pitch deck? In yet other words, he says, we believe we can disrupt a multi-billion-dollar established industry, but the moment we put that out there, we are cautioned to hold back.
Okay, fascinating. So my first take on this is you should be crazy. You should sound crazy, but the right kind of crazy. The phrase that I've used in the past here is head in the clouds, feet on the ground. And so as an investor personally, I love to see a founder who says, we are going to disrupt a multi-billion-dollar established industry. But, as the old saying about how do you eat an elephant goes, you eat it one bite at a time. And so if all I see is like, here's this multi-billion-dollar disruptive industry and we're going to launch a frontal attack and disrupt it, then I'm like, okay, you're not the right kind of crazy. You're the wrong kind of crazy. In particular, you're the kind of crazy who's just going to get crushed by this multi-billion-dollar industry. So what I want to see is a founder who has this massive ambition, but knows where to start, right? Has a very practical idea about what does the next 6 months look like? What do the next 2 years look like? What does the next 5 years look like? Because startups are an iterative game. And, Chris, you often talk about, the embarrassingly narrow slice. How do you get into that industry? And then how do you expand to eventually disrupt that multi-billion-dollar industry? Because it doesn't happen all at once. Another framework that we've discussed in the past, not ours, but I think is relevant here, especially in the context of pitching, is sometimes called ABZ or ABZ for our North American listeners, which is saying, okay, what you really want to do is talk about that end state, that wildly ambitious end state, Z, which is disrupting the multi-billion-dollar industry. But then go back and say, okay, the first couple of steps, the A and the B on the way to getting to Z, we have a really concrete, realistic, pragmatic plan. Now, everything between B and Z, so, C through Y, we're not sure yet. We've got some vague directional kind of ideas, but head in the sky, right, which is Z, feet on the ground, A and B. And if you do that right and you pitch to good investors, then they're going to be excited. You say that the moment you put that out there, you're cautioned to hold back. There are two possible diagnoses, or it could be a combination of the two. The first is you're not spelling out the A and the B very well, which means you sound like you're the wrong kind of crazy. Or the other is you're talking to investors who perhaps don't have that highly disruptive venture capital mindset, in which case you're probably talking to the wrong folks for what you are trying to do.
Yeah, I 100% agree, Yaniv. So just to add a little bit of color to that, I think if an investor is telling you to hold back, as you said, Yaniv, they may think that you're not articulating a realistic plan, which is, as you described, you're not talking about A and B. They may be the wrong investor and are afraid of ambition and global disruption. Or there's the third possible reason, which is you have not demonstrated your ability to execute in any meaningful way. You're a first-time operator or a first-time startup founder, and you've just not shown that you've been able to make any headway in the business, and yet you're asking for money. So broadly speaking, there are kind of two ways of pitching this, and Yaniv, you touched on one. One is to say, here is a massive multi-billion-dollar opportunity industry that deserves to be disrupted, and they're fat, and they're wasteful, they're slow, they're inefficient, and we want to disrupt them, and here's where we're going to start, and here's a pragmatic starting point. The other way to pitch it is, hey, we figured out this little simple thing. It's very humble, but we have cracked the shit out of it. We're growing 20% month over month. People love us. It works. And if we just keep growing this thing, we have a very, very healthy outcome. And guess what? This is a great wedge in the world to unlock adjacency 1, adjacency 2, adjacency 3, which gets us to a multi-billion-dollar business. And so you can pitch it in whatever way you like. Here's a big problem, and we're starting in this small thing. Or we've started or stumbled onto this small thing, and we have a pathway to making it massive.
Yep.
But either way, you're demonstrating a clear-eyed, pragmatic plan. And better if you're demonstrating actual real traction against that plan already in the bank. It's already done, and you're raising money to accelerate it.
Brilliant. Okay, Colin, I hope that's helpful. I wanted to take a moment to talk about one of our sponsors, Trilligent. Trilligent is a global strategic advisory firm that is tailored to startups. But what does this mean, and what can Trilligent do for you? Say you're looking to expand into a new country. This is one of the riskiest moves any startup can make. It is all too easy to be blindsided by differences in the culture, the competitive landscape, regulatory gotchas, trademark disputes, hiring challenges, and so many other hidden landmines. Even if you get past all that, you're naked. All of your contacts, your reputation, your brand count for nothing. You're starting all over again on foreign ground. All those doors that open for you at home, they stay firmly shut in the new country. It's scary. So, what's a founder to do? Call Trilligent, of course. Trilligent's global presence combined with deep local expertise will give you access to local market experts, regulatory advice, and the best PR people, all under one roof. Plus, Trilligent's advisory board gives you access to an even broader network of domain experts nearly everywhere in the world. So if you've got a specific tricky issue and you need someone who really understands the space, Trilligent have you covered. As a startup, your context and narrative is constantly changing. Partnering with one single firm who truly understands your product and business goals early on is going to lead to greater efficiencies and, more importantly, to better outcomes in the long run. Finally, Trilligent is flexible and founder-friendly from a commercial perspective. Contact Trilligent today at www.trilligent.com and book a call with their wonderful COO Laura to find out how they can help you grow your startup with confidence. That's www.trilligent.com, Trilligent, to speak to Laura, their COO, today. This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. The team at Vanta are passionate about helping you secure your business. By vastly cutting down on the time to get compliant with frameworks like ISO 27001, SOC 2, and Essential 8, Vanta lets you close deals, sleep better at night, and get back to building your product. Help yourself and help the podcast by going to vanta.com/TSP for an exclusive 20% off deal. Okay, so our next question comes from Harry Spurrier in Adelaide, and Harry asks, in deciding what feature to build next, how do you deal with competing opinions and priorities to align on a decision?
Yeah, we kind of already addressed that, right? So I have two major ways that I like to prioritize. If there is no product or there is no meaningful usage, then I like to use what I call the yellow brick road strategy, which is I'm trying to get my users from here to the Emerald City, and I'm going to pave that path from beginning to end. So Dorothy's going to go along the yellow brick road, and at some point she's going to run into dirt. But she can see the Emerald City, so she's got sunk cost, and she'll walk through the dirt to do the last mile. And so I try to build the product experience, minimum viable product experience, from beginning to end, making the earliest parts the most incredible. And it's okay if the user hits a little bit of dirt towards the end because they're close to the value. And then I try to get a first pass at the paving all the way to the Emerald City. That's for products that don't have an end-to-end pathway and don't have a lot of usage yet. For products that do have usage, especially statistically meaningful usage, and is roughly working out, but there's some bottlenecks, I like to use the strategy that I just talked about earlier, which is the number one reason more people are not being more successful more often. And it could be anywhere from awareness to retention. And I unblock and uncork those bottlenecks one by one by one. And so those are the ones there are other frameworks out there like RICE and blah, 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 but these are the ones that I like to use.
Okay, so I interpreted the question slightly differently. So I think we can provide both interpretations and hopefully that's helpful, which to me, this is a question about alignment and internal organizational issues. And Harry, we did actually have a whole episode on alignment last year, so I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that one. But I think fundamentally, there are two things here, right? Which is when you have competing priorities for aligning on a decision, you need to understand why you have those competing priorities and work backwards from the company's strategy, because competing priorities are very problematic, right? What that means is you have a fundamental misalignment and you need to fix that by going to the top, going to first principles and saying, what is our strategy? And even agreeing explicitly at the leadership level on what are our priorities as a company at a top level. And then in a sense, using those top level priorities to help guide you on the lower level priorities. right? And then the other piece is sometimes you just have different opinions. You also talked about competing opinions, right? And for that, I like the disagree and commit framework, which is basically saying, okay, we have a debate, we have an argument, and then a decision gets made, right? And whether or not it was a decision that you were personally arguing for, you fully commit to that decision and you execute on it as if it were your own idea. Now, what do both of these things have in common? And I think this is something that I've struggled with over the years, and I think there's a subtlety here, which is ultimately you need to have a single decision maker. Now, I like collective decision making, which means in general, I think it's better to make decisions together than just to have one person make a decision. But you absolutely need somebody who has the authority to be the tiebreaker, right? And so I think if you're talking about what are our company priorities, what's our company strategy, that goes all the way to the top. It is the CEO's choice. The CEO can and should be getting input and making decisions collaboratively, but it is their decision to make. Lower down in the organization, I do think you need to have some sort of understanding of whose call something is, so that if you get locked in a debate and you don't know how to make a decision, then there is someone with that reserve power to make the decision. Because the worst thing you can do is have this disagreement, have this misalignment, have this difference of opinion, and never resolve it, never collapse it and say, okay, we need to deal with this difference. I think that's actually the biggest issue that can come up is you just kind of agree to disagree and go your separate ways within your same organization. And then you're working at cross purposes. You're having destructive interference. And that is worse than even a bad decision is no decision at all. So really make sure that you deal with that aspect of it.
Yeah, so 100% Yaniv. So what you talked about should come before what I said. You need an embarrassingly narrow problem, market, and use case, and you need to agree on that at the very, very top. And you need an embarrassingly narrow product to address that problem, market, and use case. And if you've defined that clearly enough, these prioritization trade-offs become much, much easier, and often they evaporate because the answer becomes obvious. And if the problem doesn't become much, much easier or evaporate, then you probably haven't uncovered enough implicit disagreement about that narrow market, or you haven't narrowly defined it enough. You need to define it even more narrowly. So if the problem doesn't diminish to the point of almost evaporating, then you haven't solved that upstream problem yet. And when you talk about the disagree and commit, the last thing you said there is so important. There must be a tiebreaker. In larger companies, that should be the product manager. And failing that, or in smaller companies, they should escalate, of course, to the chief product officer and the CEO. I'm talking about product priorities now. And so, yeah, do not allow yourselves to spend more than a week litigating and relitigating an issue. And do not let your leaders abdicate their responsibility and say, hey, you guys figure it out, or I'm not sure, or we'll let you know. And weeks and months pass. Hold your leaders' feet to the fire and hold your own feet to the fire, and not let this kind of relitigation and circular debate go on for too long.
Just one more point on that, actually, Chris. And again, encourage folks to delve into our back catalog because we have a lot of stuff about this. There's also an episode on escalation. And I think that's actually one of the bits of secret sauce that can really help in terms of allowing you to make collaborative decisions by default, but always having tiebreakers. And the concept of escalation is saying, okay, we try to decide together, but we don't just sort of end up with a horrible decide by committee, agree to disagree. If we cannot positively agree on something and then commit to it, then we escalate at the next level up, right? You sort of have an escalation path. And escalation is not the nuclear option. It is a tool that's available to you if you can't make a decision by yourself, right? And so you're like, oh, we can't decide on this together. We'll escalate it to the person who has the ability to break the tie. And so you always have a tiebreaker available. And that cascades all the way up the organization to your single point of tie breaking, which I guess will usually be the CEO. And that's something that you can build into your culture. So it's not like, oh, I'm snitching, I'm running to mummy or daddy because we can't make a decision. It's like, no, I'm escalating because this is how a healthy organization works and how we make sure we have good decisions.
Now, of course, sometimes your CEO, your product manager, or the general culture you have just doesn't know the answer, and they don't know how to do it. They don't know what they don't know, or they don't know how to do the thing that we're giving advice on today. So, of course, you sometimes need outside advice. You need an outside advisor, an outside consultant, an outside mentor to help you out. And sometimes that's not a lack of knowledge or a lack of experience. That's sometimes just simply, as you like to say, Yaniv, it's hard to read the label from the inside. I often talk about once you're in the forest, you don't know necessarily where north is. You and I both, Yaniv, I think are guilty of the same psychological weakness, right? Which is once you're in the problem, in the weeds, it's easy to get lost. It's easy not to know the right answer. And so getting a fresh pair of eyes, getting an experienced hand to take a look at it is often priceless, actually. And so consider that as well. All right, Mark from Brisbane asks, as a finance leader inside a product-led tech company, how would you coach me on learning more about the product and dev teams so that I can understand their resourcing requirements and metrics for success better?
Thanks for the question, Mark. I think it's a really common one and a really self-aware question, because I've definitely seen this kind of situation where, you have finance leaders sometimes at a scale-up company. They're brought in as a CFO or a financial controller or whatnot with a lot of experience in other sorts of industries that I guess are more mechanical and more metrics driven and more about margins and P&Ls and sort of things that Chris, you and I often talk about, saying, well, especially at the earlier stages of a startup, that's not the appropriate way to be thinking about everything. So what I would say here is having finance and the sort of product and dev teams understand each other. First of all, it's a two-way street. I think you need to understand them and they need to understand you. Because again, I think, Chris, I don't know how you've seen this, but I've come from a product eng background. And for a long time, I'm slightly embarrassed to admit it now, but I guess I shouldn't be, is I didn't really understand what finance people did other than keep the books. I didn't understand when people said, oh, CFO is a strategic role. I'm like, how can finance be strategic in the startup? We're product-led. We're trying to build a product. Finance is just there to make sure we don't run out of money. And I've learned about this stuff. And so, look, I don't have like a super concrete answer, but I think one thing I've talked about before in a high functioning organization is that the leadership team needs to be a team. And this is the concept from Patrick Lencioni's book, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. If you have finance and product and engineering and you have a senior leadership team and you don't take the time to coach each other on this stuff, then that's actually where the issue begins, because you can't make decisions as a team if you don't spend the time educating each other on each other's functions. But Mark, spend time with the teams. I think that is really one of the core things. Like, ask if you can just attend a sprint planning and get a sense of how these teams operate. Listen to the Startup podcast, of course. Which I think you're already doing, but, also read books like Marty Kagan's book, Inspire, and stuff like that, just to get a sense of the product mindset and so on. And then the final thing is to really think about the economics of startups, which is something that we talk about here as well. Like, if you're in software or biotech or whatever, which is high CapEx, low OpEx, right? And low marginal costs, so high margins, right? And you're like, okay, so I'm a finance person. I understand that. Let me consider the established wisdom, but also try to think first principles. It's like, I'm in a business that might be different from ones I've been in before, where we're in this perspective of we're trying to build this money printing machine we've talked about before as well, right, Chris? Which takes a lot of time to build the machine. And then once the machine is built, you can print money for much lower than its face value. And it's like, I'm the finance function here. How can I do the things I need to do, be strategic, impose a certain amount of discipline, do the right kinds of modeling and forecasting, while not falling prey to false precision and not falling prey to, I guess, maybe the sort of the established wisdom that might come from lower margin businesses. The point is, and we've actually done more of this, I think, Chris, educating product folks, which is why I say it's a two-way street, which is, it is the economics of software that actually drive how startups work. If you don't understand the financial economic aspect of it, you don't really understand how startups and venture capital and these massive outcomes all happen, right? So educate your product team and in turn, have them educate you on how it is they're thinking about doing this high fixed cost, low marginal cost work.
Yeah, it's funny. In my notes, when I saw the question, my first answer was listen to the Startup podcast, as you said,
So you're doing it right already.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I want to add to this a couple of things. The last thing you said there, I think, is really, really important. I've met a lot of finance guys in startups who do not understand that simple idea that software requires high CapEx and low OpEx. And this idea of investing ahead of the business is essential. And so they're all tied up in like, well, Chris, that's a lot of money. And oh, Chris, I don't know if we can invest that right now. And oh, Chris, I'm not sure if we can raise money. And oh, Chris. And it's like, let me assure you, these are not my opinions. And let me assure you, you must raise money because your appetite and your commitments are way larger than your capital and your cash flow allow. And you cannot run this business on revenue. I find a lot of companies in this position with very conservative CFOs who just do not understand the basic economics and are fighting me tooth and nail on basic startup mechanics. And so that's the first thing, is get educated on the business model and the reason capital and VC exists. The second thing I would say is when you're thinking about the resourcing they need in terms of like the people they need and the structure of that org, I don't think you need to be an expert on that, actually. I think you need to lean on your CPO and CTO and listen to them. When I'm acting chief product officer for companies, 50% of my job at the beginning is figuring out the strategy. And then 50% of the job is helping them to design the org to execute against that strategy. And so as the CPO and CTO, we're soldiers in the foxhole together, designing an org chart and figuring out which heads do we have and need to replace, and which heads do we urgently need to place. And that suggests a budget, right? It suggests resources, suggests a whole bunch of stuff. And as the CEO, as the CFO, you should rely on your CTO and CPO to design that org chart to meet the needs of the business strategy. And what I also find when I'm doing this is that these companies are often way, way, way underfunded. When you slice up this amorphous blob of an engineering and product team into actual squads with actual missions to handle the actual commitments and workloads and strategy that they've committed to, you figure out that the team is probably 25% of how big it needs to be. And so what you need to do is scale back the ambition of the business and focus, which is more often what you need to do, or scale up the team if you have the capital and the cash flow. And so if you don't have a great CTO and CPO capable of giving you an org chart, then fire them and get new ones, or find an advisor or coach who can help them. It's really, really important.
Look, I mostly agree with you, but I also think there is a role for building empathy, right? There's that sort of trust but verify piece. And I think it's very human, right? Sure, you want to trust your CTO and your CPO, but you also want to understand what it is that they're talking about. And especially if you come from, a larger org or less of a software background, understanding the constraints and the challenges that those functions have, I think as a finance leader is really valuable. And spending a bit of time with the team to understand that is valuable. When I first joined Google, it was quite funny. I think people are a bit more educated now, but it was a 5,000 person company at the time. So a lot smaller than it is now, but already pretty big. And I used to tell people, like my friends and so on, that are about 5,000, 6,000 people working there. Some people would be like, but why? It's just a web page. They thought that we'd have like 10 people or something, right? The complexity of the software was so hidden away that they just didn't understand why a web page, I know, a pretty blank one, it was mostly white and just a few links, why it needed thousands of people on it, right? And so I think getting that empathy for what it takes to build software is actually really valuable for a finance leader who is working in software and working in startups.
Of course. I mean, this connects all the way back to the first question, right? Which is You want to change, you want to evolve, you want to develop empathy for the other position, and you don't want to waste all your time trying to become something you're not. And so it's a balancing act. Do both. Trust what they're telling you and verify and learn and empathize.
At risk of repeating myself, I think I've just seen it too often where there's nearly this fear, especially, you mentioned, Mark, you're in a product-led tech company, and sometimes it can feel like the product and engineering teams are kind of like the gods, and you don't question the gods. And I actually think that's really unhealthy. And, sometimes I remember working with senior finance people, senior folks in other functions who come up to me kind of shyly and say, can you explain how software works, like how coding works, because I don't really understand. And they have these blind spots that they're afraid to close because they're afraid of kind of being made to look stupid. And I actually think that's really harmful, right? Building a product-led software company is quite an unusual type of organization. If you're going to do your job in finance well, you need to understand what is in some ways the beating heart of it. And you should take the time to learn. And if you're a leader in those functions, you should make sure not to be so arrogant as to scare off people who just want to understand what it is that you do in a bit more detail.
So true. I talk always about great product leaders and great engineering leaders. Part of being great, part of being at the C-suite or even at the VP level or what have you, is educating the rest of the business on how to think about your function and how to think about your processes and how to engage with those in a productive way. And so I end up spending a lot of time meeting with the CFO, meeting with the CMO, meeting with everybody going, here's how we think about this in product. Here's how you should think about this. Here's how to engage. I just came out of a meeting actually with a company I'm advising where they were reverting back to muscle memory because I've helped them transform to product-led. And they're spinning up this parallel product process without involving the product manager. And the argument is always like, well, this is different. This is a special. This is a one-off. This is just while we get ramped up. It's like, stop. Remember, here's how it works. Here's why it works. Here's why this is problematic. Here's why this is not a special. And it's just part of my role here as interim chief product officer is to educate over and over and over again. Big thing.
Okay, folks, that was another action-packed episode of the Startup Podcast. But if you've been listening for more than 1 or 2 episodes, you know this podcast is not free. We have the pact. In return for all the hard work that we put into making this show and providing you value, we ask you to do a couple of very small things, and that's all we'll ever ask of you. We would like you to please follow us in your listening app, subscribe to us on YouTube, and give us a shout out on LinkedIn or wherever it is that you have your audience. This is about looking inside yourself and saying, am I the sort of person who honors a pact? Of course I am. I'm an honorable person. So stop that guilty feeling nagging in the back of your head, thinking, really, I should get onto that pact. Stop what you're doing right now, hit pause, and go do those couple of simple things, and then you can ignore this from now on. Chris, that was a great episode. See you in the next one. This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta helps businesses get and stay compliant by automating up to 90% of the work for the most in-demand compliance frameworks. With over 200 integrations, you can easily monitor and secure the tools your business relies on. Head to vanta.com/TSP for 20% off their incredible offering and start unlocking extra revenue today.